Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was born on the 16th of October, 1936, in the small village of Yablanovka in the Voronezh Oblast of the Soviet Union. His childhood coincided with some of the darkest chapters in Soviet history: the famine of the 1932, Stalin's purges, and the devastation of World War II. His family lived in harsh conditions. His father worked on the railroad, while his mother struggled to keep the household afloat amid scarcity. The constant struggle for survival left a deep imprint on Chikatilo's young mind, combining fear, helplessness, and an acute awareness of human suffering. From a young age, he was physically frail and frequently ill, which isolated him from other children and left him with a profound sense of vulnerability. Psychological and biographical records suggest that this physical weakness contributed to feelings of inferiority and social anxiety. He was often mocked or bullied by peers, which fostered a simmering resentment and frustration. Stories of hunger, death, and displacement during the war years intensified his emotional strain, leaving him deeply alone. He reportedly struggled with social interactions, particularly with girls, and longed for connection that he could not form. This combination of social isolation, shame, and frustration began to shape his fantasies and inner life in ways that would later manifest in terrifying ways. During his teenage years, Chikatilo experienced delayed sexual development, further heightening his sense of inadequacy. Despite his social difficulties, he excelled academically and enrolled in a pedagogical institute, intending to become a teacher of Russian language and literature. His academic success was a rare source of personal validation, yet his social alienation persisted. He remained shy, awkward, and often frustrated by his inability to form relationships. This sense of inadequacy became a recurring theme, combining with a growing obsession with power and control over others. As an adult, Chikatilo maintained the appearance of a calm, unremarkable man. He worked in teaching and other jobs, married, and had children. From the outside, he seemed ordinary and responsible, blending seamlessly into society. Yet beneath this facade lay a complex and disturbed mind, a mixture of unresolved trauma, deep-seated anger, and deviant fantasies. These internal tensions would later drive him toward a pattern of horrific violence, meticulously planned and horrifyingly executed. His psychological profile was a combination of early trauma, social rejection, sexual frustration, and compulsive sadism. Experts who later studied his case noted traits consistent with severe personality disorders, antisocial tendencies, compulsive sexual deviation, and ritualistic behavior. He developed a desperate need for dominance, control, and the ability to impose his will on others, particularly those who were vulnerable. Sexual sadism played a central role. Chikatilo reportedly derived intense gratification from the suffering, fear, and ultimate submission of his victims. His acts were rarely impulsive. They were carefully orchestrated and ritualized, reflecting both his planning abilities and his compulsive drive. The first known murders began in the late 1970s, around December 1978. His early victims were children and adolescents he encountered near train stations, bus depots, and remote areas. He exploited his unassuming demeanor, offering help, companionship, or small promises of assistance to lure victims away. The Soviet criminal justice system at the time did not recognize the emerging pattern. Each disappearance was initially treated as an isolated incident, allowing Chikatilo to operate freely for several years. He frequently selected secluded locations such as forest edges, abandoned buildings, or remote railway embankments. There, he committed sexual assault, stabbing, strangulation, and often post-mortem mutilation. Even in these early murders, a ritualistic pattern began to emerge. Chikatilo's actions were not merely about killing. They were a method of asserting dominance, releasing tension, and enacting fantasies that had been building for decades. His meticulous planning, the precision of his attacks, and the calmness with which he approached potential victims demonstrated both his intelligence and his profound pathology. By the early 1980s, Chikatilo had entered a particularly active and violent phase. Operating mainly in the Rostov region, he preyed on vulnerable individuals, children, teenagers, and young women who were alone or lost. His polite and quiet appearance lowered their defenses. He increasingly employed specific lures, offering food, rides, or assistance. In rural or poorly supervised urban areas, victims often had no reason to distrust him. Once isolated, he unleashed brutal violence acts that were both sexually motivated and deeply sadistic. The escalation was evident. His later attacks were more organized, more violent, and more ritualized than his earlier crimes. Chikatilo's methods varied depending on the environment. In urban areas, he frequented railway stations, marketplaces, and bus stops, looking for children or young women traveling alone. In rural regions, he would patrol forest paths, orchards, and abandoned buildings. Victims who were considered easy targets were often girls he knew, or children who trusted him due to his calm demeanor and seemingly helpful nature. Some accounts suggest he would follow potential victims for hours, studying their routines before acting. Once he selected his victim, the act of abduction, assault, and murder followed a chillingly predictable pattern, almost ritualistic in its execution. In small towns, residents began noticing an uneasy pattern. Children were disappearing near bus depots, some never returning from evening walks, others vanishing while playing in the woods. Parents warned their children to travel in groups, but fear alone could not stop Chikatilo's calculated hunting. Some villagers reported seeing him lingering around stations or marketplaces, smiling politely at passers-by, blending into daily life. His unremarkable appearance made it nearly impossible to suspect him. Even police officers failed to see him as a threat for years, because he did not fit any conventional profile of a violent criminal. Rumors spread quickly in tight-knit communities. Mothers whispered warnings to each other while preparing dinner. Shopkeepers watched their doors nervously, and children walked in clusters, gripping friends' hands as if physical contact could protect them. Evening shadows seemed deeper, forest paths more menacing, and the whistle of the wind along railway tracks sounded like a distant cry. Even the ordinary noises of the town, a train passing, dogs barking, footsteps on cobblestones took on an edge of anxiety. The predator was invisible, yet everyone sensed his presence. People would glance at the empty streets with unease, imagining what unseen dangers might lurk behind the familiar houses and trees. Patterns in his killings emerged over time. He often struck during colder months when shorter days and poor visibility aided concealment. Victims frequently shared traits: young, vulnerable, traveling alone, or socially marginalized. He occasionally targeted pairs or small groups, and he increasingly incorporated ritualistic elements into his murders. Each act reinforced his compulsions, creating a vicious cycle of gratification and escalating need for violence. The emotional and psychological compulsion behind his actions became more pronounced with each killing, fueling a cycle that was difficult for investigators to predict or interrupt. What set Chikatilo apart was the intensity of his inner experience during the acts. Witnesses could never know the thoughts running through his mind, a mixture of anticipation, frustration, and a disturbing form of satisfaction. He often described a sense of release and euphoria immediately following a murder, as though the act temporarily resolved the inner conflicts that had haunted him for decades. At the same time, he reported a sense of guilt and shame that lingered, compelling him to plan the next act more carefully, to refine his rituals and satisfy urges that could no longer be denied. The victims' experiences were terrifyingly vivid. Children who sensed danger would feel a tightening panic, a heart-pounding fear that seemed to echo in every footstep. Some tried to flee, others froze in disbelief. The moments before abduction were filled with the subtle tension of trust betrayed, the polite smile of a stranger, the offer of help, the hand extended in apparent kindness. Once isolated, the sudden violence shattered any illusions of safety, leaving an indelible imprint of terror. The Soviet authorities were slow to respond due to systemic limitations. Forensic technology was basic, and behavioral profiling was in its infancy. Crime scenes often provided minimal evidence, and victims were chosen so carefully that witnesses were rare. Yet eventually, investigators began to recognize the signs. Patterns of sexual assault, post-mortem mutilation, and specific victim types suggested a single perpetrator was responsible. Communities were gripped by fear. Children were kept indoors, local parents patrolled streets, and rumors of a man in the shadows spread through towns and cities. Behavioral psychology became a key tool in tracking Chikatilo. Psychiatrists like Alexander Buchanovsky constructed a profile predicting his behaviors, habits, and preferred hunting grounds. Surveillance around bus and train stations intensified. The breakthrough came when authorities noticed him lingering in locations matching the behavioral profile. He was arrested on the 20th of November 1990, near a bus station, carrying a briefcase containing knives and other items linked to his crimes. While initial forensic tests were inconclusive due to previous errors, his confessions and the evidence gathered from witness reports sealed the case. Under interrogation, Chikatilo confessed to over 50 murders, describing in meticulous detail how he selected victims, lured them away, and executed his crimes. He led investigators to the remains of many victims, explaining his methods, rituals, and motivations. His trial began in April 1992, capturing widespread media attention. Prosecutors presented confessions, witness testimony, and forensic evidence. Psychologists testified about his sadistic compulsions and abnormal behavioral patterns. The defense attempted to argue mental illness, but psychiatric evaluations confirmed he was sane and fully responsible. He was convicted of 52 murders and sentenced to death. On the 14th of February 1994, Chikatilo was executed by a single gunshot, ending one of the most infamous criminal cases in Soviet history. The victims, numbering over 50, were children and young women from different walks of life, each a tragic reminder of Chikatilo's cruelty. He exploited everyday spaces, train stations, marketplaces, forests, turning ordinary places into arenas of fear. Witnesses described towns under a shadow of anxiety, parents walking streets at night, children warned never to stray alone. Even in broad daylight, strangers were eyed with suspicion, and whispers of a predator lurking in familiar places spread quickly. Entire communities altered their routines, afraid to let children wander freely. People would tell stories of near encounters. A child rescued just in time. A teenager who noticed his calm, watchful gaze and hurried away. Shopkeepers recalled a polite man lingering by their stalls, asking directions, only to leave mysteriously. Forest paths once filled with laughter became silent, except for the crunch of dry leaves and the wind's eerie whistle. Trains clattered across tracks under a gray sky, echoing like distant warnings, while street lamps flickered on cold nights as parents held their children close. Each town seemed to hold its collective breath, aware that danger could strike without warning, anywhere, at any time. This pervasive tension, combined with the horror of his acts, left a lasting scar on the memory of entire regions. Even today, the story of Andrei Chikatilo is studied and recounted not only for its grim fascination, but as a cautionary tale about human pathology, systemic failures, and the complexity of evil disguised in ordinary form. His case continues to teach investigators, psychologists, and criminologists about the depths of human depravity, the signs of compulsion, and the delicate interplay between trauma, isolation, and violent behavior. It also reminds us of the fragility of social structures and the vigilance required to protect the most vulnerable members of society. The shadow he cast over Rostov and surrounding regions remains a chilling example of how appearances can deceive and how human cruelty can remain hidden in plain sight.